Sorry about that, babe.
Well, we finally made it. After ripping through the final 2 games of the Verdite trilogy in recent months, we've arrived at a new, from a story standpoint, yet sadly likely final entry of the Kingsfield series, and that of Kingsfield 4, aka The Ancient City. Kingsfield 4 is a first-person action role-playing game that was developed by FromSoftware and published in North America by Agetec, released on the Sony PlayStation 2 on March 25th of 2002, almost 6 years after the release of Kingsfield 3. The story. As mentioned, we are now out of the land of Verdite and into the now cursed lands of Helladine. The king was given an idol. The idol brought forth a state of corruption, decay, and curse upon the lands.
The idol must be returned.
From there, the swordmaster Septiego, accompanied by a group of strong warriors, went to return the idol. As you could probably expect, they were never heard from again. Some time passes and Prince Devian in the kingdom of Azaleen hears a knock on his door. A cloaked, shrouded stranger unveils the source of the destruction. The idol of sorrow has now been found and given to the prince. It is now up to you to return the idol to revive the kingdom and the ancient lands. A pretty straightforward yet dark premise that piqued my interest from the opening cutscene. As you venture forth throughout your journey, you'll learn more about Helladine, the Holy Forest, the ancient city, and the people of these lands, the forest folk, the earth folk, and the wars that waged with the dark folk. The graphics. As you could probably expect, the jump from PS1 to PS2 was a vast one. The graphics are incredibly improved over the first 3 entries. More details, more textures, and areas that come to life. Heck, even the NPCs finally have faces, who would have thought? The graphics help add to the mood of each area that you traverse, and your quest seems darker and grittier than ever before. Along with the overhaul on the surface is a markedly improved gameplay feel. The game now runs buttery smooth at 60 FPS instead of the insanely low frame jank of the previous entries. Though admittedly at times Kingsfield 4 feels slower somehow compared to that of, let's say, the second and third entry, where you could zip around at a much higher clip. The part that I like the most about the graphics are, despite the makeover, they still maintain that same ominous, dark, and dreadful feel of the Verdite trilogy, just more enhanced. Music and sound. Oh boy, Kingsfield goes shining again. While I felt like the series took a slight step back with the third entry regarding the music and sound, did they ever step it up in this one? I wanted to specifically shout out the sound design in Kingsfield 4, it's just so good. The groans, growls, slashes, clanks, the sound of the walking, it all fits so well, and I can't begin to tell you how many times I heard ambient noises or things off in the distance and so forth while playing through using my hoary neck phones, and it kinda just blew me away. I even had areas that just downright creeped me out solely due to the sound. I'm looking at you, Ocean Fort area, which neighbors the Widow Queen's lair. But of course it doesn't just end there, what a friggin' banger of a soundtrack. Composer Tsukasa Saito, who also worked on titles such as Eternal Ring, the Echo Knight game, some Armored Cores, and more recently on Bloodborne, Sekiro, Dark Souls 3, helped put together one of the finest soundtracks that I've ever heard. Where do I even start? The intro cutscene features a mishmash of excellent tracks and an ominous voiceover painting the scene of the curse quest ahead. The title theme is iconic and is later remixed as the track of the final area of the game. Elden Ring with the theme and Radagon's theme, anyone? Tons of the tracks earlier in the game remind me of Eternal Ring mixed with something like from the Silent Hill universe. You just have such a great variety of catchy, atmospheric, hectic, and at times majestic tracks. Some of my favorites include the following: The Mine, King's Throne, The Egg Throne, Earthfolk Village, which has a part that reminds me of a New Order track, which might be weird, but it sorta did remind me of it, whatever. The City Ruins, and my 2 favorite tracks in that of the Holy Forest and the Mansion of Howling Winds. Legit, the Holy Forest might be one of the most chill tracks that I've ever heard, and the Mansion of Howling Winds makes its presence felt immediately with both the task at hand and the atmosphere, leading you directly into the end of the game. Just thinking about it makes the hair stand up on my neck. It's an amazing soundtrack with amazing sound design. It's almost flawless, I truly mean it. Controls. Again, if you have any familiarity with Kingsfield, you probably know where this is going. Despite the frame rate improvement, the game itself is still rather clunky and slow. In some ways, the feel is better than the previous entries, but in other ways it's worse. I do swear on my life that Kingsfield 2 and 3 control quicker and you have an easier time with faster paced combat, which unfortunately for the controls kind of lagging behind, said faster combat happens more frequently in Kingsfield 4, especially with the bosses. Arguably the controls and movement might be worse in this than any of the other entries, which is a big bummer and blemish on the game for me. It almost felt like there was a relearning curve coming from the Verdite trilogy at the beginning. Something just felt slightly different and off about the controls and movement in this one. Gameplay and fun factor. Other than the sound and music design, this is where Kingsfield 4 shines the brightest. When you think of Kingsfield, you think atmosphere, and that is certainly not lacking in Kingsfield 4. There's something I can't quite put my finger on, but it feels just even more different than the Verdite trilogy. I felt like I lived in the ancient city at times. You truly felt every single descent deeper and deeper until you finally placed that cursed idol where it belonged and rid the world of the dark. The ancient city itself was mesmerizing and a looping, winding maze. The interconnectivity of Kingsfield 2 returns in a big way where more or less you can get to anywhere from anywhere with just a little bit of warping or patience. Briefly, the warping system in this game revolves around placing markers and using corresponding wands of the same color on warp tiles in order to fast travel to these specifically placed markers to help make your quest more convenient. In a way, it's similar to Kingsfield 2, but obviously a little bit different because you have to be on the floor markers in order to fast travel. The game kind of leads you into these fairly linear areas at the beginning, then the further you go down, where I would say the turning point was the ancient city into the Holy Forest and beyond, and it becomes a super tangled interwoven web with various spin-offs. There's just so much variety to keep you interested: an ice area that turns into a lava area, a minecart section, underwater segments, caves, crypts. And the two that I specifically wanted to shout out yet again, the Ocean Fort area leading to the Widow Queen's lair, dropping some insanely creepy and brooding atmosphere, where you find beaten and downtrodden soldiers from the failed expedition, eventually going into said Widow Queen's lair, which in my opinion was the hardest area of the game. Tough enemies, draining resources, and a crazy level design that leads you into running from tough enemies around a corner and instantly bumping into the Widow Queen herself. It's just nuts, and areas like this give FromSoft their name when it comes to difficulty. Which, briefly, I would say probably Kingsfield 4 is the toughest of the four that I remember. I'm not saying it's overly difficult, but I think it did give me the most trouble. Some gameplay changes that are pretty cool include the following. Your keys that you pick up, they now work instantly, which is nice and helps save some unneeded menuing time. Oftentimes throughout your journey you'll find pieces of equipment and weapons that seem very similar, but if you read the descriptions and look at the stats, you'll see that there are actually tons of variations, which is super cool, as I was expecting, for example, to find the same sword over and over again, only to find that, hey, it has a different description, probably a different name, and is better in certain areas than others. Speaking of the equipment, durability and equip load is a thing. The lighter you are, the more easily your physical meter will refill, and the durability basically works as follows. The more you use and more damage you take, the more your durability will go down, and your equipment and weapons will degrade and get weaker. This isn't too bad, but it can rear its ugly head once in a while, though the game does a pretty good job of giving you new equipment and weapons at a fairly decent pace, making durability not the biggest issue in the world. However, later on you do find a dwarf who's able to repair your equipment and even upgrade with Kingsfield 4's version of the Prometheus pieces. The cool thing about the repair is that it's free, and it runs on a real-time clock. It doesn't stack up on top of each other. Meaning if you give him 3 pieces of equipment with a 6-minute time estimate of repair, it won't take 18 minutes, it'll just be the 6. I find the dwarf repair service and durability to be an interesting addition to the game, but it's not game changing or altering by any means. Also back in action is the magic system, more or less from Kingsfield 2. That's right, when you find magic crystals and consume them, you learn new spells of the elemental crystal that you consumed, the way that God intended. I was not a fan of the Kingsfield 3 magic system, and I found that 4 was a step back in the right direction, even if I just used my old faithful Windcutter for 85% of the playthrough. Each magic spell and weapon for that matter are on a level 1 to 3 system, where the more you use, the more it goes up and advances. So it's pretty cool to have all this variety, but unfortunately I found that you constantly found new weapons, and unless you really went out of your way to level these things up, you wouldn't really experience much change. Which leads me back into weapon magic. Yet again, I didn't use it at all in this game. That's 2 Kingsfield games in a row where I didn't use any of it. Whether it be my fault or lack of communication from the game itself, I don't know. Thankfully, much like with Kingsfield 3, I didn't need weapon magic here either to be victorious. Still kind of a bummer. Oh yeah, and if you've been following along with my content, you probably want to know how the skeletons are in this game. They're kind of my litmus test for Kingsfield. I could safely say that they are about average. Kingsfield 3 to me still has the hardest skeletons. Negatives. I'm sure at this point it seems like I'm verbally flating Kingsfield 4, and for good reason. However, the game is not without its flaws, and I wanted to highlight some of them here again or for the first time. As mentioned, the controls are still very sluggish. Kingsfield 4 might be the most sluggish of the bunch in comparison to some of the enemies and bosses that you need to fight. They're running around and jumping like acrobats compared to you in your cement boots. I also find that, while nitpicky of course, the secret doors and wall spaces in this game close super fast and sometimes don't make a lot of noise. In the other Kingsfield games, you can go clicking aimlessly on walls, and when secrets are discovered, you'll know it. Where in Kingsfield 4, there was actually a few times where I discovered a secret and I ended up leaving or having to come back later because it closed so fast and silently that I never noticed. Some of the cooler areas in the game I felt weren't fleshed out enough, such as the Holy Forest, the underwater town, the area where you get the Moonlight Sword, and then conversely areas such as the Ocean Fort were perhaps a little too fleshed out at times, which also leads me to the endgame. I loved it, except the final area and boss. Sure, the area itself looked cool, but all in all it was just kind of annoying, and the boss was truthfully lame. Kingsfield 3 is probably my least favorite of the bunch, but it's still very good of course. I felt like that game nailed the final boss situation perfectly, where the boss in Kingsfield 4 is more or less just a gimmick fight, which then leads into one of 2 lackluster endings. It's a bit of a bummer. Modern FromSoft comparisons. Fans of Kingsfield that are sick of the modern FromSoft comparisons, you might want to fast forward a bit here, because I'm just going to straight up dump some stuff that I found throughout my journey and I wanted to share. I felt like overall Dark Souls 2 and Demon Souls grabbed the most inspiration from Kingsfield 4. There are bits and pieces of inspiration from other FromSoft titles of course, but those were the 2 that resonated most with me. I'd say the general feel of the game reminded me of those titles, as Kingsfield 4 also exudes a very high fantasy, dreamlike, and ethereal feel. There were lots of enemy designs that reminded me of enemies and bosses from future FromSoft games. The huge spider reminded me of the armor spider from Demon Souls. The undead soldiers reminded me of Hollows and Undead from Demon Souls and the Dark Souls games. The Widow enemies reminded me of the homies from Sen's Fortress. The Widow Queen herself had a little bit of Myth of the Baneful Queen in her. A lot of the fire bosses reminded me of admittedly loose inspirations for bosses such as the Flame Lurker and the Old Iron King. And there were even NPCs that were somewhat familiar, like the Downtrodden Man at the beginning of the game, as well as the NPC in the Widow Queen's lair going on about the living in a negative fashion, such as Grave Warden Agdane from the Undead Crypt in Dark Souls 2. Then you have areas like this with statues on the ceiling looking almost like those of Queen Alana's likeness scattered throughout Dark Souls 2, and specifically in Shulva Sanctum City. Speaking of Shulva, the entirety of the ancient city reminded me of Shulva so much, which for a Dark Souls 2 stan like myself made me feel so happy inside, and gave me more appreciation for both Kingsfield 4 and Dark Souls 2. And then there were even smaller areas you don't go into as much, such as the one where you get the Moonlight Sword looking straight out of the Bed of Chaos boss arena from Dark Souls 1, or this area towards the end of the game of a flooded town, which is very similar to that of New Londo Ruins in Dark Souls 1. There are even more that I didn't mention, but these were the ones that stuck out most to me and I wanted to go on about for a little bit. And yes, to answer your question, there were a few areas with poison. Summation. Before playing, I saw nothing but adoration for Kingsfield 4 from the great Kingsfield community. Being the curmudgeon that I am, I thought there's no way that I'll like this more than Kingsfield 2. Nope, not happening. Well, I was wrong. Kingsfield 4, the ancient city, lived up to the hype and then some for me. I will go on a limb and I'll say that this is one of the finest RPGs of all time, let alone on just the PS2 or in the Kingsfield series. As such, I give Kingsfield 4, the ancient city a 9 out of 10. I will gladly be returning the Cursed Idol at some point in the future. What an epic ending to the Kingsfield series, and please, oh please, somehow, some way revisit it in the future. I know they won't. If you've enjoyed this review, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you haven't already. If you want to see more Kingsfield 4 content, check out the end screen, pinned comment, or description below for my first ever playthrough as well as the unboxing. And if you also want to go searching around on my channel, possibly in those areas, I have also covered Kingsfield 1, 2, and 3. Take care.